Alrighty, so thank you for showing up on Labor Day. We're all here together, in it together at 4 o'clock on Labor Day. I'll give you some announcements, and that's usually how I will start, is whatever weekly announcements I have, and then I'll jump into the lecture. Today will involve a little bit of logistics as well, and then we'll talk about what you guys are going to cover in lab this week, okay? So a couple things. First of all, always bring your calculator to lab. It seems like organic chemistry doesn't necessarily always involve calculators, but it does in lab. So always bring them. We will use them frequently. We will also use quizzes that use them frequently. So make sure you have them every week in lab, okay? Including, so I'm giving you this heads up with a note that we have a quiz this week. So make sure you have your calculator for this week and all the weeks forward. Your homework that we gave you last week in lab was to have the pre-lab for experiment 1 in your notebook before you come to lab this week. And make sure you include the flow charts for all 3 parts, 1, 2, and 3, okay? So make sure you have, we showed you the flow chart for number 1, make sure you have the flow charts for 2 and 3 in there as well, okay? So what we are going to grade you on this week when we take your notebooks is your experimental from last week, that's already in there. And then the pre-lab that you're putting in for this week, and we'll check that pre-lab as soon as you come to lab this week. So you can't keep going if you don't have that pre-lab in there. For future weeks, because we will have met at lab lecture before you start lab, you want to make sure you always have your pre-lab in your lab notebook before you come to start a new experiment. So in a couple weeks, we'll start experiment 3. When you go to start experiment 3, you'll want to make sure your pre-lab is in your notebook at the start of the lab period, okay? Next week's experiment will be a little bit different, and I'll explain that in lab lecture next week. All right, so that's kind of the note with experiment 2. We'll do that next. That's what we're doing next week. It's modeling experiment, so it's nothing really in lab, so per se. So like you'll meet for lab, but it's all on computers, so the pre-lab is different. And then don't forget, you do have a quiz this week. Typically the quizzes will be over whatever you're doing that week. Safety is always fair game on a quiz. So this week, we went through a lot of safety. That would be something I would probably count on as a possibility besides just experiment 1. But at any point along the way, if we feel like safety's kind of slacking, or we feel like we need to remind people of the rules, that is always fair game on the quizzes, all right? I'm gonna talk about open lab here in a minute. But the labs are open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9:30 to 3:30, 9:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. unless something happens to change that. And we've already got one of those coming up, so I'll talk about that here in a minute. I will put on the other board kind of the topics for the day. I won't necessarily go back and forth to refer to them, but they will be there so you can kind of see where we're headed. All right. So I'll always start with this announcements portion, and then I'll work into the rest of the lecture. So, questions on the announcements? Yes?
So for like quiz 1, is that just over like possibly safety and what we did last week in lab, like part 1 of experiment 1, or is it all of experiment 1?
All of experiment 1. So what I covered today is also fair game. So basically that's kind of, as far as what's going to be covered in lab lecture, today is the end of experiment 1. So all of it is fair game. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Can you disclose like the format, or is that something that we should just wait for?
On the quiz?
Yes.
That is dependent on your lab prof.
Okay.
Usually it's some combination of some sort of short answer, multiple choice, fill in blank, like really kind of any possibility of testing questions is on there. So it kind of is at your lab prof writes the quiz. So yeah. It's up to them what they put on. Alrighty. I